much of what we've witnessed on campus are not individual speakers getting up and saying whatever they please, or professors even getting on Twitter and saying what they please. These are people who are organized into mobs. Mobs are dangerous. Mobs are threatening. Mobs, at the very slightest provocation, can become violent. Mobs are created in order to affect intimidation.
Welcome to The Contrarian. I'm David Bernstein. In a world filled with noise, I'm here to provide the signal. Hello, and welcome to The Contrarian. I'm your host, David Bernstein, and today we speak with Randy Barnett. Randy, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thanks for having me, David. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I think we first met each other years ago on a trip to Israel. I think we were both Tikva fellows at the same time. It was with Bill Crystal, who led the program. Is that right? You remember that?
That's correct. Yeah, that was a very, very memorable program for me.
Yes. So lots happened since then, particularly in Israel, and I think that's going to inform the conversation we're going to have today. Let's just dig right in. This has been obviously very trying times for the Jewish community and those of us who have been pushing for freedom of expression as well. On the one hand, we see a college campus on fire in many ways, and with all this radicalism and all this anti-Semitism and all this pro-Hamas sentiment that we're even seeing in some of the survey data. And we want it to go away. We want to create safe environments for Jewish students. And on the other hand, we believe in free speech. We want there to be free speech. And what I'll also note that in the campuses that have the most free speech are also those that tend to be the less anti-Semitic. So I want there to be free speech. And yet I don't know how to navigate it because some of these campuses are not applying their speech codes equally, or they're not applying their free speech equally. They're free speechers when it comes to Jews, but nobody else. Or they restrict discourse when it comes to everybody else except Jews. How do we begin to think about this from both a legal and a sort of cultural standpoint, political standpoint? How do we think about this tension between those two? I just want to make sure I state it well. Freedom of expression, free speech, and equal protection.
Right. Well, let's first of all understand that free expression, freedom of speech is an underlying norm or value. I would say it's a natural right. That's independent of whatever legal duties or there are or not on the part of government or private actors. So the First Amendment happens to protect the natural right of freedom of speech, press, and assembly, and that has certain legal or constitutional consequences for the federal government. The 14th Amendment extends those protections to the states. It has legal consequences. But there's also the underlying value or culture or norm of freedom of speech and freedom of expression that we're for. So it's important to keep those distinct because how those norms are actually put into practice is going to be very context dependent. Mm-hmm. What the legal duties are of either government agencies or private agencies who accept government money is separate from how you cultivate a culture in which free speech is protected and respected. Free expression is protected and expressed. So we could take a few examples. Let's, for example, talk about people who are supposedly expressing their freedom of expression or their freedom of speech when they get up and they interrupt speakers who have been invited to speak on campus and attempt to deplatform them by screaming and yelling at them. Now, are they engaging in speech and expression? Sure they are. But nevertheless, that exercise of that freedom of expression is interfering with other people's freedom of expression as well as the freedom to consume or hear what the speaker is saying. So what this seems to call for, as it normally does in the civil society, is the regulation of all these liberties so as to protect the liberties of everyone. And that would mean barring, in my view, interfering with some people speaking when those people have a perfect right to speak where they are, probably because they've reserved a room and they've scheduled the time. These are what are known in the law as time, place, and manner regulations of speech, and they're perfectly appropriate. And in fact, they're absolutely necessary, because if you allow some people to exercise their so-called free expression rights in order to prevent others from likewise free exercising their expression, then you've really undermined the culture of free expression. And the people that are engaged in this activity know full well that's exactly what they're doing. And they themselves do not value free expression except as a tool or a weapon to be used against their adversaries. Let me take another example. Let's take masking. In the wake of the Ku Klux Klan, who engaged in masked activities to terrorize African Americans and others who would sympathize with African Americans, anti-masking laws or masking bans were passed throughout the country. You could be free to exercise your freedom of speech, but you couldn't do so while masked. Many of the people that are engaged in these protests, both on campuses and elsewhere, are masked. This has a number of consequences. It has an in terrorem effect on the people who are around them. It means they can't be held accountable either socially or any other ways for the behavior that they're engaged in. And I think it should properly be regulated and, in fact, banned the way the Klan was banned in order to allow people to express themselves, but also to allow other people to feel safe while these are happening. The last example I will give is mobs. Much of what we've witnessed on campus are not individual speakers getting up and saying whatever they please, or professors even getting on Twitter and saying what they please. These are people who are organized into mobs. Mobs are dangerous. Mobs are threatening. Mobs, at the very slightest provocation, can become violent. And mobs are created in order to affect intimidation. And so to equate mob advocacy by masked people expressing their view with simple freedom of expression, I think, is to make a big mistake. We need to be realistic about the effect of activities or conduct that are not themselves speech, like wearing a mask, are not themselves speech, like engaging in a mob action, and trying to protect those as though they are speech, when in fact they're actually efforts at intimidation and coercion.
So there's actually case law out there that would allow, let's say, a judge to order people to take off their masks at these protests on campus?
No, this wouldn't be a judicial decision. This would need to be a statute or ordinance, and there have been statutes and ordinances. There are in some of the places where this is happening, they're just not enforced. And that's the other thing, by the way, that the 14th Amendment was enacted to do, was to provide for the equal protection of the laws, which nowadays is interpreted to be sort of a general equality provision. But in fact, the original meaning of that was the emphasis was on the word protection, not on the word equal. That is, governments in the South were failing to protect some members of their population, the African American members, or white Republicans in the South who sympathized with them. They were deliberately and consciously failing to extend the protection of law enforcement to them. There are laws on the books against blocking bridges. There are laws on the books against obstructing traffic. Most of what we're witnessing that are at least in the public spaces outside of campuses are illegal. It's illegal conduct, and yet those laws are being flouted. And we don't hear the same calls from people who say that no one is above the law and that the rule of law should be recognized. We don't hear the same calls to have those laws being enforced. In fact, I believe there was a message. There was a text message sent to people on their way to Union Station in D.C. that said, "Be advised, there will be delays because people in the vicinity are engaged in First Amendment activities."
Right, I saw that. Outrageous.
It's outrageous. It's absolutely outrageous. That is the government failing to enforce its laws, failing to live up to its duty to equally protect all of us from these sorts of activities.
Yeah. When you were telling me about the masking possibility, my first thought was, okay, I'm going to have to get legislation introduced. And my second thought was, I can imagine the politics of public health that would quickly follow that, follow suit with people insisting that of course you have to be masked because people might get COVID. So, but
let me speak to that, because almost all of the COVID regime were done by local officials, but in particular governors, by executive order under the so-called emergency powers that their state constitutions gave them. None of these were done by law, not directly by law, not by statute itself. Now, they may or may not have been lawful as a lawful exercise of a power delegated to them by the legislature, but these are emergency powers, and it's very, very dangerous, and it's a fundamental threat to a free society and a constitutional republic to have government by emergency powers. That's how tyrants rule, is by emergency powers. And we had governors across the country ruling by emergency powers and essentially making an exception to their anti-mask laws that were already on the books in order to mandate that you wear a mask. So at least at the extremes, one can argue that a mask regime, an anti-masking statute, there could be emergency exceptions made for public health crises. Let's see how those exceptions are defined, and let's see how carefully they're hewed to. So you can allow for the possibility of an exception. I think it's dangerous to do it, but you can at least allow for it in principle without saying that in the absence of that rationale, people need to, they can't hide their face. Also, forget putting our free speech to one side and our concern about the Jewish people to one side. We have an outbreak of unbelievable lawlessness that's happening in major cities around the country, all of whom by people who are masked. And this is considered okay, when in fact, if you wore a mask, in the past, you were considered a bad guy. You were immediately suspect and dealt with as a masked man, except for the Lone Ranger. But then again, even the Lone Ranger, because he wore a mask, was constantly being thought to be a bad guy until the local people got to know that he actually was really a good guy, notwithstanding the fact that he wore a mask.
There's a great article to be written, "Masking Lawlessness" or something like that. But yeah, thank you. I'm very interesting digression there. I wish I had I'd spend the entire time just on that if I didn't have other material to get to. So let me jump to that other material again. So let's say I'm a student at a liberal arts college. They have a very strict I'm a Jewish organizational leader because I feel more comfortable in those shoes. And there's a kid at a small liberal arts college who's complaining about being harassed and hostile treatment. That college has a pretty robust microaggressions policy that they readily enforce with other protected minority groups, but don't seem to be enforcing much with this Jewish student. So I have a choice. I could push the school to drop its microaggression policy and say that's illiberal, and to suggest that it violates really their own stated commitment to freedom of expression. Or I can try to get them to enforce their microaggression policy to Jewish students. What do you suggest?
Well, we're facing that conundrum in this. You're hypothetical, but we're also facing it in the DEI reality, where Jews are faced with a choice. Do they advocate being included as an oppressed group within the DEI hierarchy, intersectional hierarchy of who's oppressed and who's the oppressor? Or do they oppose the DEI hierarchy altogether? I think the obvious correct answer is to oppose the DEI hierarchy altogether.
Yes. I have an article, by the way, yesterday called "The DEI Dilemma." It's a long essay, 4,000-word essay on that. And I come down exactly where you do on that.
Right. So
Although I do think there's a case for an alternative form of liberal DEI in places that would actually go through it. I just don't believe that any of the current DEI bureaucracies would be capable of implementing it.
No, and that's because they were all selected because they buy into the intersectionality, which is really what DEI is about, which is that there is, as you know, and I'm sure your viewers of this podcast know, the intersectionality is simply that there is a hierarchy of oppressed and oppressors, and that the more boxes of oppressed you tick off, because oppression is intersectional. It goes, so for example, African Americans could be persecuted or discriminated against. Women could be discriminated against. Well, if you're an African American woman, now the intersection of those two categories makes you more oppressed. That is why it's called intersectionality. And then the irony, of course, is the most oppressed people that still survive in the world are the Jewish people. And yet, under this ideological, cultural Marxist approach to intersectionality, they are considered to be white and therefore oppressors. Why? Because they're successful. And again, I'm not sure this makes coherent sense, but there is a lot. It's sort of because this whole philosophy is false to its root. It doesn't have to make sense. It just has to be implemented as the need of the moment requires it to be implemented, right. And that's exactly what we see.
Yeah, it's not about truth; it's about power, really.
Right. Exactly.
And so let's take your DEI analogy. I mean, in general, my stance and stance of my organization, Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, is actually to reject the framework, right? So it might be with ethnic studies out of California as well. There was a big push in the Jewish community to try to get them to modify the curriculum so that it's accepting of Jews, so that it's not explicitly anti-Israel, but to accept sort of the decolonial ideology that went along with it, or to let it pass at the very least. And I rejected that. I said that's going to be that fundamental ideology in the curriculum is going to produce anti-Semitism and, of course, liberalism in society. So why should we let it pass? And here I agree with you again about DEI. And yet, when it comes to sort of equal protection, free speech, I feel like it's a more thorny dilemma in a way, because equal protection itself is a liberal value. I by insisting that a university or college upholds equal protection, I'm in a way also supporting the law. Am I not?
Well, there's a Saul Alinsky tactic, and Saul Alinsky in his book Rules for Radicals had a lot of insights, had a lot of valid insights on how you maintain a radical movement. And one is you make the other side play by their rules. And there's a time and place for that. And I'm in favor of pursuing multiple strategies.
Yes.
One is, root out this stuff, root and branch. And the other one is make them play by their own rules in order to confound them. And it does, up to a point, confound them. It can confound them. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
And so it's not this is not a one size fits all. There is a standard playbook. This is all going to be, it's going to have to be adjusted for the circumstances that individual people and groups find themselves in. I do want to make one other point, though, before I forget. And that is that, first of all, just for those in the audience that aren't aware, DEI stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. It is none of those things. It's been a complete capture of these words, these nice sounding words, to do something that isn't so nice. But the true enemy of DEI are not Jews. The true enemy of this are whites, of which Jews then become categorized, and then Jews get subsumed within the category of white. And so it's very important for Jews to realize that they may be singled out now as the canaries in the coal mine, but they're only singled out as part of a larger philosophy that is aimed about them. In some sense, it's not about us. And anti-Semitism is almost never about us. Anti-Semitism is usually about grievances and causes of which we become a very handy scapegoat. But the scapegoat is not who the thing is really about. The scapegoat is the means to the larger end. And the larger end is the opposition to Western civilization, the West in general, which is associated with their category of whiteness. And so what's happening, what reminded me to say this was when you mentioned anti-colonizing. Israel is accused of being a colonizer, but if the very same people at the very same time and just as loudly accuse the United States or the Americans of being colonizing, that we're colonizers too. And just like Iran refers to Israel as the little Satan and America as the great Satan, these leftists view Israel and the Jews as the little colonizers, and Americans and whites generally are the great colonizers. And that is really the fundamental clash of civilizations conflict that we find ourselves into. And so we Jews should not, A, think it's all about us, or B, think we're alone. And it's one of the reasons why a lot of non-Jews identify with what's happening to Jews in the United States and what's happened to Jews in Israel. The one reason they identify, many people identify with it, is because they understand this. I see a greater understanding of the larger conflict on social media amongst the intelligentsia. And by this, I don't mean professors necessarily. I just mean people who are engaged in public discourse. There's a really pretty widespread comprehension that this is bigger than us.
Yes.
And that's
it's
really
an opportunity,
important.
by the way. It's an opportunity for us to change the larger system because it was about us also. It's an opportunity to change the larger system. It was interesting. After October 7th, I noticed that many of my friends in the liberal community, who I think were a bit skeptical. I wrote the book Woke Anti-Semitism, so I've been writing about precisely the issues that you've been talking about. I think that they were a bit skeptical about my claims of anti-Semitism because it sounded like they were part of the larger identity politics and claims of grievance and the like. And I'm always careful about that, by the way. I always say I situate my discussion of anti-Semitism in liberal discourse, not postmodern discourse. In other words, you're free to challenge me. You're free to say I'm full of shit about anti-Zionism being a category of anti-Semitism or whatever. Fine. Let's have a discussion about it. I don't want to mimic wokeness in my discussion of anti-Semitism. But that said, what happened was they started to see how radical these pro-Hamas people were. And the people like Claire Lehman from Colette Magazine started to say, wow, I didn't appreciate anti-Semitism until now, and it is fierce. And the other thing that's happening is there is some small critical of Israel group within liberalism who are saying, oh, what's happening with universities now is just like what happened after George Floyd. It's a moral panic, and we're reinforcing illiberalism on campus. And I think they're really missing, even though I disagree with them on Israel and everything else, they're really missing the opportunity that exists here. This is an opportunity for a critical mass of people to get so angry at what's happened on campus to actually shift the overall campus culture. Do you agree with that take?
Yeah, I mean, if not now, when? I mean, I am somebody who's, because I am in the university system. I'm at Georgetown, and I'm quite prominent as an academic, and so therefore I'm around. I go to a lot of schools. I spoke at Northwestern and University of Chicago day before yesterday. Next week I'm speaking at Harvard, Yale, Columbia, NYU, and Princeton. So I get around. But in terms of the elite or the sort of the name brand schools, I'm actually quite pessimistic about whether these schools can be taken back from the left, because the liberals, the old time liberals, let the leftists in, and then the leftists want to close the door to everybody but leftists, and even if individual appointments get made at the margin, and Georgetown faculty voted an offer to someone who was right of center to teach constitutional law for the first time since 2005 when they voted me an offer. So even though this can happen at the margin, there's just no possibility really of creating any kind of parity within these schools. So that makes me somewhat skeptical about the ability to go after it root and branch in that way. Nevertheless,
let's talk about that, because I think that's what we're actually on this podcast trying to explore. It seems to me that there might be ways of changing the structure of universities. I have some ideas about it. I don't know whether they would work or not. I think you could do what they're doing at Yale Law School. Isn't Keith Whittington creating a new program that might on open inquiry? I don't know what it's called exactly. I'm hoping to bring him on the podcast. That could start to compete against sort of the illiberal juggernaut at Yale and become the more dominant voice over time. It won't happen overnight.
David, this is one of the, I was going to say this is the way, as they say on The Mandalorian. I was going to say this is the way, but this is just one of the ways, but it is one. For example, I have the Georgetown Center for the Constitution, which is a very robust group in Georgetown law with the imprimatur of Georgetown law. We have an annual originalism summer seminar. We have an originalism for judges seminar. We do a number of things. Keith is going to have a group at Yale. Steve Sachs, a newly appointed from Duke at Harvard Law, is going to has a group there. Will Bode has a center at Chicago. Mike McConnell has a center at Stanford. I do think creating enclaves within schools where the faculty are not going to be balanced can create a balance for the students who are the real consumers of education. And we have programming for students, and all of these other centers can have programming for students. So that's one way to go. You have centers within the existing institutions. Another way, that's at the graduate school level. At the undergraduate level, you're seeing a comparable phenomenon happening in red states. You see the Hamilton College or the Hamilton Center at the University of Florida. You see Civitas at the University of Texas. You see Skettle at ASU. There's another group at Tennessee. There's another group forming at Ohio State. And so this is happening, again, creating alternate colleges within the colleges to get around the dominance of the left at individual colleges within a university. So students can come in. You want to send your kid to the University of Florida because you're a big Gators fan and it's the best state school, you think. You want to send your kids to the University of Florida, they can go and major and enroll in the Hamilton College and get a liberal arts education at the University of Florida while everybody else is getting woke. So this is
that might outcompete over time. It might attract the better faculty and the better students.
Yes.
And over time, universities may allow the market to speak there and shift their priorities.
So in the a third model, which is also happening, and I think it's something that donors, especially Jewish donors, need to be very mindful of, and that is the creation of alternative new institutions.
Like University of Austin.
Like University of Austin at Texas, or New College, Florida, in Sarasota, where I am now. Now that's not a new institution, but because of Governor DeSantis, the board is now majority conservative or generally conservative, I would say, and the board of trustees. The president is supportive of this program, and they're creating an alternative within the Florida state system of a college that's actually going to be a genuine liberal arts college, like Hillsdale is a general liberal arts college, though it's private. So Jewish donors should be aware of all of these groups and start shifting their support away from just writing a check to Yale and writing a check to Harvard or writing a check to Georgetown, for that matter, and create endowments that you lose control of, and contribute operating expenses, donations towards operating expenses of all three of these models,
and see what happens. See what works.
There's no guarantee that we'll succeed, but I can tell you at the Georgetown Center for the Constitution, which is 10 years old, we've done some really amazing things with what little. We've had very nice funding from donors, but it's not like we're a huge organization. And yet, with the money we have, we've done a lot of things.
Yeah. Mark Cherendoff, who's the CEO of something called the Maimonides Fund, recently came out with a piece in Superior Journal, and he argues that, and this is advice to philanthropists: find 10 colleges that are struggling out there, and offer them tremendous resources if they sign up for liberal values, and make those the model universities. I thought that was an interesting proposal.
I think if properly fleshed out and figured out how to make it kind of enforceable, because people are happy to say one thing while they take your money and then do something else with it. I think that's a very nice idea. I mean, look, that's exactly what's happening with New College. New College was extreme. I mean, it wasn't done with private money; it's done with legislative money. It was so struggling; it couldn't keep its enrollment up. It was virtually open enrollment, and 90% of their students would transfer out when they got a chance. And so the legislature kept threatening to close it because it just was dying. Which is one of the reasons why even some of the left-wing faculty at New College, many of them left. But many of them stayed because they realized that they had a very bad business plan and that this approach was likely to save the college. And they'd been worried for decades about what was going to happen to New College. And it has worked that way. So New College is kind of an example. Only instead of a private donor throwing their money behind it, you have a governor and a state legislature who's doing the same thing. And I think red state governors and red state legislatures in red states should be doing this with all of their public institutions.
Yeah. I actually just wrote that piece I described on DEI and the Jews, and I argue that there needs to be a separate red state and blue state strategy when it comes to DEI, that red states should try to ban it or significantly modify it. There are also purple states. I think in Wisconsin, for example, the governor and the legislature agreed that they would limit DEI hires. They would cap them, I believe, or they would reduce them. I think they would reduce them significantly as long as they would raise salaries for college professors. And I thought that was an interesting.
Didn't they get voted down?
It might have been.
At the end of the day, they made this great deal, and then I think somebody voted it. Some veto gate there somehow got rid of it. But I could be wrong. Maybe it got through in the end.
Yeah, we'll have to take a look at that. I'll put it in the show notes. That's fascinating. But the example of DEI would seem to present a more optimistic scenario. I mean, I think if we were having this conversation 4 months ago and I told you that DEI would be on the ropes right now, you might have thought I was crazy. And here we are watching this groundswell of opposition to DEI right before our eyes. I can imagine a future now I couldn't have a few months ago where DEI becomes sort of much more marginal force in universities and certainly in the corporate sector. Doesn't that give us a sense of optimism that this kind of deep structural reform is possible?
Well, I'm generally an optimistic person. So that's my natural state. I will say I'll believe it when I see it. Because they can weather a lot of storms. What you're experiencing now, David, is a storm. We've generated a storm. There is a storm. The question is, will they weather it or not? They tend to. They're ensconced. They're in well fortified positions, and I don't know who is going to be there to ferret them out. So we're going to have to persevere, and not think just because we've had the definitive critique that we've necessarily won when they just sit there, and once things quiet up, they just come out of their tunnels.
I can easily imagine that happening, and it very well could. We've spoken about these reforms in Florida that have been done and elsewhere now, and I believe that in order to do structural change, you're going to need sort of a stick, right? There's going to have to be aggressive action, but politics is not a liberal enterprise in many ways. Politics can be a blunt force. Politics can shut down alternative views, and you can easily imagine what replaces it being illiberal as well. And I note that in Florida there is also these divisive concepts legislation that would prevent the discussion of critical race theory in college. I oppose that because I think it's illiberal. Yet I certainly support the governor, getting rid of DEI bureaucracies at universities, or even changing the board of governors at universities. How do we navigate that, where there might be some forces that are some actions that are illiberal in nature? Maybe you disagree. Maybe you think it's perfectly fine to ban divisive concepts. And how do we navigate the tension between people in a movement who really aren't necessarily liberal? They just want to get rid of DEI or get rid of wokeism.
Well, there's no magic answer to this. When you push back and you're essentially invoking the powers of the state in the case of state universities, it's always possible for things to go too far. It's a little tricky. I don't necessarily support the ban on divisive concepts, but on the other hand, it is within the purview of whoever manages a university to pick and select amongst what is taught and what is not taught. Particularly in order to create a flourishing academic environment.
Sure.
I'm not sure. I mean, I really can't say that I know this, David, but I'm not sure how that divisive concepts language in Florida was actually going to be applied, would have been applied. I think it's already been stayed or enjoined by a court. So I would like to read the language again because I haven't read it for a long time. I made it the subject of my final exam in Con Law 2 last year. I gave them the language of this, but if it's simply saying that no person should be disparaged, that professors should not be disparaging groups based on their group nature, which is actually what intersectionality does. If what you're banning is the disparagement of individuals, of students who are in the class by their professors, I don't know that that's beyond the purview of an institution to ban. What shouldn't be on the institute within their purview is to ban the actual teaching of a particular theory. So people should be able to read Kim Crenshaw on intersectionality and read what she has to say. You're not going to just snuff that out as a form of learning knowledge because you need to know what she says in order to say what's wrong with it. That's the free marketplace of ideas working. And so I think that you have to draw a line between the teaching of the subjects and the use of these frameworks in class to actually berate and make feeling and create an otherness for some members of the group of the students that are there.
Yeah, and we have all these ethnic studies programs and women, gender, and sexuality studies programs. I'm calling them that because I learned that that's now the going term. And these were from their inception deeply illiberal programs. They were not scholarship. They were activist oriented. There might be some counterexamples. For example, the Harvard Black Studies program, headed by Henry Louis Gates III, believes in scholarship. He believes in scholarship, and he's actually quite critical of a lot of other Black studies programs he believes are practicing a kind of activism. But it seems that that it'll be very hard to end the preeminence of those programs. We already talked about how some ways we might be able to do that through offering better academics. But I guess the question I have is, could you imagine a university, let's say, auditing these courses and saying we are not going to have any course that fundamentally stifles free inquiry. We're a university that believes in free inquiry, and we're going to monitor courses for that. And that doesn't mean we're going to monitor everything a professor says. We're not going to stifle their academic freedom, but your academic freedom doesn't mean that you get to engage in a kind of academic malpractice that stifles free expression of ideas. Is that inherently a violation of academic freedom to do that, or could a university say we're going to get rid of either whole departments or specific professors or classes if they don't adhere to those rules?
I don't think it's a violation of academic freedom to do things like that, or depending on the devil will be in the details of things like this, because freedom of speech is not an end in itself. Free expression is not an end in itself. It's a means to an end. It's a means to truth. Right. And to the extent that it's being used in a way to stifle the pursuit of truth by becoming an orthodoxy that then gets imposed on students or even on staff who have to take special training and show how that they've incorporated all of these lessons, then it's the opposite of what freedom of expression is really for. And so to the extent you have a university that creates a mechanism, and by the way, you do need an internal enforcement mechanism for any of these platitudinous policies to be carried into effect. You could have the greatest free speech policy in the world that's implemented, the Chicago along the Chicago line or any other line. And unless there's a way for individual students or faculty to file a complaint with an ombudsman whose job it is to be the free speech ombudsman in that school, not the DEI people, but a separate free speech institute, a free speech enforcer who has and then becomes an institutional interest to enforce free speech. These things are just what James Madison were called parchment barriers, which is how he referred to bills of rights.
Interesting.
We need more than parchment barriers. We need enforcement mechanisms, structural enforcement mechanisms within these institutions.
Yeah. The University of Michigan, I think it was its board of trustees, recently came out with this very powerful commitment to freedom of expression and ideas, and it was going to be the new University of Michigan, yet they have a $30 million DEI program that's actually in expansion mode. So one wonders how they're going to ever actually practice what they preach. And if they don't have structures in place to at least neutralize the effect of its DEI program, it's going to be just parchment.
Well, that goes back to where we started this conversation, that for people on the left, this is free speech for me and not for thee. And in some fact, going all the way back to the free speech movement in the 1960s, it was always that way. It was free speech for the left to challenge the hierarchy and to do what they had to do. But the very minute that they had any power or influence, it was not free speech for other people. It was a purely opportunistic invocation of free speech.
Right. Randy, you have a new book coming out, A Life for Liberty, The Making of an American Originalist. Tell us about your new book.
Right.
When will it be out?
It's coming out in July, but you can pre-order it now on Amazon. And if you do, you'll get it. You'll lock it in at the current price, which may go up once the publisher sees how long this book is going to be. It's a book that tells my life story, and it's the story of a contrarian American Jew who grew up in a non-Jewish community called Calumet City, which is south of Chicago, which was a predominantly Polish Catholic town. A lot of Protestants there too, but there's 4 Catholic churches in a city of 28,000. And the Jewish community that I grew up in was across the state line in Hammond, Indiana. And so all the liberal or progressive Jews went there. That's where I hung out with them. So I was kind of the odd man out, being a Goldwater Republican at that time, having argued on behalf of Barry Goldwater in front of my entire junior high school student body when I was 12 years old in 1964. So I was sort of the odd person out being a Jew in Calumet City, and I was an odd person out being a conservative in amongst the Jews. So it's what it's like to grow up that way, and the lessons that it taught me, all the mistakes that I made as I was growing up, and a tribute to the mentors that I had. And so it is a story of mentorship, but it's also a story of how you cultivate mentors. And then, if you're doing it right, you should thank your mentors before they pass from the scene. I was very happy when I wrote this book to realize that I thanked most of my mentors when they were still alive. And then how I went from being a conservative Goldwater Republican to be a libertarian when I was in college, and then being very active in the libertarian intellectual movement when I was in law school. Became a member of the board of the Center for Libertarian Studies in New York. And then I went on to be a criminal prosecutor in Chicago, and I couldn't put in the stories about that because the book was already too long. That'll be a subsequent book where I talk about fighting crime and corruption in Chicago. But after that, becoming a law professor and eventually becoming an originalist and helping develop the originalist theory from essentially no theory at all in the 1980s, just a label that was made up by somebody on the left to describe what people were doing on the right. And provide a very robust theory. So we went from 1987, when Robert Bork was nominated and identified as an originalist and was soundly defeated. 30 years later, for the next 30 years, no Republican nominee to the Supreme Court identified as an originalist until after they were on the bench. And then in 2017, 30 years later, Neil Gorsuch became the first Republican since Robert Bork to identify as an originalist, and it didn't do him any harm. What happened in those 30 years is the growth of the originalism movement. And in the book, I discuss that growth and the role that I played in it, as well as the last thing I'll say, because I'm kind of going on here, is the book opens with my role as the counsel for Angel Raich in the Gonzalez versus Raich constitutional case that I argued in the Supreme Court on behalf of her using medical marijuana in California as authorized by state law. We challenged the federal prohibition on that unsuccessfully. And then the final case in the book that's discussed is the NFIB versus Sebelius case, the challenge to Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, where I developed the reason or the argument for why the individual insurance mandate was unconstitutional, something that had not occurred to Republicans prior to the theory being developed by me for the Heritage Foundation. And it was only after we identified this theory that the Republicans did make a constitutional point of order and had a big debate in Congress. And at that point, the constitutionality of that law was put into play. So the book tells all of those stories. But I think it's a good object lesson for people, especially younger people who want to know, well, how can I make a difference? Because that is really what motivated me. And this is a
testament to the power of ideas, really.
Exactly. And also to sticking to your guns, even when your ideas are in the minority. How if you stay with them long enough and you are lucky enough not to catch a disease that you can't control for, and you keep at it, eventually things can come full circle, and you can actually be recognized and have a big impact if you stick with it.
Yeah. I recently, 3 years ago, left sort of the mainstream center-left Jewish world. I was the head of a mainstream organization and started this new endeavor that put me at odds with a lot of my former colleagues. And people treated me as a kind of heretic in a way for pushing back against this ideology, whatever we choose to call it these days. And I realize now all of a sudden I'm going to speak to mainstream Jewish organizations, especially post October 7th, but even before October 7th, to be honest with you. And I realize that even the people who don't say much at these meetings actually mostly agree with me. And so we're winning the argument. Somebody really attacked me on Facebook. Somebody I've worked with in the Jewish world really attacked me on Facebook the other day. He's the head of a Jewish institution, and I realized like he's attacking me because he feels like he's losing his grip. And so I feel like we shouldn't overestimate it. I mean, we still have a lot of work to do, but I feel like we're turning a corner now, and it feels good to have the wind at our back for a change. So
yeah, we may have seen a high water mark for the other side. Whether the tide recedes or not, we have to keep working on. But it may have peaked. And it usually, and the way these things usually go, people talk about pendulums. I'm not so happy about the pendulum metaphor because it makes it seem inevitable. People overreach is what happens. If you have a certain amount of power, you can overreach when you have that power, and it's in the course of overreaching that the counterattack can take place.
Yes, they overreach, and what they do is they end up in an echo chamber because they're overreaching. They end up thinking that they're more powerful than they are. And as soon as the other side realizes the emperor has no clothes, they start to push back against it. And they realize that they've been, I call this expanding the scope of the referendum. You're taking people and you're challenging them in a larger referendum than their echo chambers would have them believe. And then all of a sudden they realize they're the minority voice. And I believe that process is sort of happening now, that more and more people are exercising some courage. So
you're exactly right. And I think getting back to what we just said a minute ago, the very fact that they have achieved such dominance in academia and in the media, especially because they've received such dominance, that's what makes the echo chamber. It's their overwhelming power in those institutions that makes an echo chamber, and then that's what leaves them vulnerable to a voice that they just don't even comprehend.
Yeah, there's another dynamic here, and we'll end in a second, but there's another dynamic here I've discovered, is that when people have established power, entrenched power, they tend to dismiss, they don't want to normalize the opposition, right? They want to, so they might say, don't engage Bernstein or Barnett there. You'll give them too much power by doing that.
We don't want to platform them.
We don't want to platform them. So people like us keep on making our arguments, and before you know it, we've gained power because they basically didn't push back because they didn't want to validate us. Right. And I think that dynamic is also starting to work its way in the discourse as well. And with that's also responsible for some of the shift.
I agree.
Randy, it's been fascinating. Good luck on your book. Thank you for your wisdom. I think you helped me clarify some of the points that I've been struggling with around free speech and equal protection, and also about structural reform in the university. You gave a lot of good examples that I'm going to go and read about now that I didn't have before. So really appreciate your insight.
Oh, great. And let me just tell the audience that if you pre-order A Life for Liberty, go to Amazon and pre-order it, you actually don't have to pay for it until July when the book comes out. You lock in the current price, but you don't have to pay for it. But all those pre-orders do help me and my publisher. So please do that. It's a cost-free thing you can do today.
Count me in.
Great. Thanks.
Thank you for tuning in to The Contrarian. If you enjoyed the show, be sure to give us a thumbs up and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Don't forget to rate our podcast on Apple and Spotify. Stay connected with us on social media for more updates. Until next time, keep challenging.